stability we're going to have if we're on our own. Because right now things aren't that bad. We do have, a law and order, right? We do have pretty good stability. We're not happy with everything, but these colonists are thinking that. Okay, the British government is maintaining law and order and stability in the colonies. We do have laws. Things aren't horrible. We don't like everything they do, but we still have some stability. The third reason why a lot of American colonists were cautious about a war is, who was protecting the colonies from British enemies now? Britain. So all of a sudden they're on their own. They're going to have to protect themselves from France or Spain or whoever might think that the American colonies are a good catch. So the British government was protecting the colonies from enemies of Great Britain, and some people very cautious. If we go to war and win this war, what's going to happen then? We're going to have to protect ourselves. Okay, and can we do that? Now, you think about this. When we get back to law and order, what kind of law and order have the colonies? If you're on the fence and you're not sure if you're a patriot or a loyalist, and you're watching what's going on in Massachusetts, what might be your thought if we get on our own? You've watched some of these things. What have the Sons of Liberty done? What have revolutionists done?
Riots.
Oh, they've rioted and tarred and feathered, and burnt homes and beat the hell out of people and everything else. So you're thinking to yourself, my God, this mob rule that I've witnessed here, is this what we're going to get if we get separated from Great Britain? Wouldn't that be kind of part of your thought if you were somebody on the fence watching this, trying to decide if you want independence or not? Well, gee whiz, is this what I'm going to get if we go independent, this mob rule? If they don't like what I say, they're going to tar and feather me. They're going to burn my house down. So there were a lot of colonists that were afraid of the mob rule that they had witnessed by colonial leaders and wondered if that was the way the colonies were going to be run if Great Britain was out of the picture. Can you understand that apprehension? Okay, especially if you're on the fence. Because I want to re-emphasize to you kids that not every single person in the 13 colonies was for getting away from Great Britain. Matter of fact, the South, who was making great money trading with Great Britain, saw this as probably a bad deal. Where's all this revolution come from? The North, and especially Massachusetts. Okay? And the final reason might be the best reason why they were cautious with war. So you fight Great Britain and you win. Woo! You fight Great Britain and you lose. You could be executed for treason. So they're thinking, well, this might be a good idea to fight a war with Great Britain, but what happens if we lose? How do you think George Washington and Joseph Warren, if he would have lived, and some of these colonial leaders, John Adams, how do you think they'd have been treated if we would have lost the Revolutionary War? I bet you they'd executed every one of them. Okay? So again, despite the happenings in Massachusetts and North Carolina, there were several reasons American colonists would be cautious about a war with Great Britain. Number one, their apparent reluctance to make a final break from Great Britain. Kind of like it's hard for you to make a final break from your parents. Number two, the British government had maintained law and order and stability in the colonies. It wasn't something they had to worry about. Number three, the British government protected the colonies from enemies of Great Britain. Number four, colonists were concerned about that mob rule that they had witnessed by colonial leaders and wondered, hey, if we get on our own, are we going to be ruled like this? If somebody doesn't like what we say or do, they're going to tar and feather us, or they're going to burn our house down. And the fifth and probably best reason is they feared their treatment if they revolted and had a war and lost, that they might be executed for treason against the king. Does that make sense of why some people would be apprehensive? Okay? Now, on the other hand, there was pretty good reasons why independence from Great Britain would be positive. Not as many, but there were a couple of reasons. What would be the number one reason, after all we've talked about, that would be positive to be separated from Great Britain? They'd be free from British rule. They had been treated poorly, in their opinion, with the Tax Stamp Act and all these other harassments. The British government had committed acts that violated their colonial rights as citizens, and many people thought we'll be much better on our own. We won't have to live under the tyranny of the British Parliament. That's one reason why independence would be a positive thing. They would be on their own, make their own laws. do their own thing, not have to be looked at or controlled by another country. And the second reason why independence from Great Britain could be positive is they had already spilled colonial blood defending those rights. And it was time to go. It was time to make that plan. So, there were a couple good reasons why independence from Great Britain would be positive for the American colonies. One, the British government had committed acts that violated colonial rights as English citizens. And number two, colonial blood had already been spilled defending these rights. Well, when did independence really start rolling? Well, it really started rolling back in January of 1776, before the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, right? Okay, so this move towards independence actually started in January of 1776. And what happened is a fellow by the name of Thomas Paine authored a pamphlet that was entitled Common Sense. Thomas Paine authored a pamphlet that was entitled Common Sense. Anybody know what a pamphlet is? Here's a pamphlet. A little bit later in history, if I can find it here. Just had it out the other day. What do I do with that? Okay, this is a pamphlet. Here's a pamphlet. This happens to be a pamphlet that Robert Kennedy put out when he ran for president in 1968. Okay, and it's just a little flyer, and it tells why he's running for the presidency. It's kind of an advertisement. Okay, he was the author of this pamphlet. Well, Thomas Paine put out a pamphlet like this that was entitled Common Sense, and it was kind of the spark that was dropped into the keg of gunpowder that blew up intentions to have independence. Okay, this is the thing that got everybody going. Now, the interesting thing about Thomas Paine is he was a former British political writer, and he came to America in 1774. So he's only been in America for a couple years, but what's he witnessed? A lot of this upheaval, right? And he's a British, not an American so much. He's a British political writer. He wrote about politics in Great Britain. And then he moved to the American colonies in 1774. So he's kind of a newbie, right? Is he kind of a newbie in the colonies? He hadn't been there for 50 years or 30 years, okay? He's kind of a newbie. And he writes this pamphlet called Common Sense. And in his Common Sense pamphlet, it stated, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. Okay? So his Paine's writing in this pamphlet that was entitled Common Sense had a statement in it that said, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. So he's writing about if the American colonies should do what? Come on, declare independence, right? And he says right away in his pamphlet, Common Sense, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. So he's stating right off the bat that his opinion on independence is based on simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. What's the common sense thing to do? Now, this is interesting because what he does is he goes on to point out, you don't have to really write this down, he goes on to point out that America has grown into a new and different nation with interests of its own. Now, let me repeat that. You don't have to necessarily write it down. He points out in Common Sense that America has grown into a new and different nation with interests of its own. Who said that? Way back in 1767. Count Verzane said that. He said he almost identically said the American colonies will go in a different direction and want their independence from Great Britain. That's what Count Verzane said in 1767. Well, here is Thomas Paine writing a pamphlet called Common Sense, and he points out that America has grown into a new and different nation with interests of its own. Now, I want you just to listen to this and then look at your ID sheet. This is how he closed Common Sense. He said, "The period of debate is closed. Arms, as the last resource, must decide this contest. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries," in your ID sheet, "'tis time to part." That was the end statement in his Common Sense pamphlet. You don't have to write that whole quote down, just know what "'tis time to part" refers to. He said again, the period of debate is closed. We're done talking about whether we need independence or not. We're done. Okay? Arms, as the last resource, must decide this contest. We are going to have to fight for our independence. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation between the colonies and Great Britain. Then, the blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'tis time to part." When he wrote that pamphlet, it was like a great speech that a coach gives before a game, and it gets everybody fired up, and now a lot more people are more interested in independence. Does that make sense? That's the idea or the thought process behind Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, he also pointed out in that pamphlet that there would be 3 practical advantages of declaring independence. Remember, he's really into this practical. The debate's over. Common sense. And here are the 3 advantages that we gain by declaring our independence. First one might seem kind of trivial, but it mattered to the people that it pointed towards. He said, if we're an independent nation, the captured patriots can demand to be treated as prisoners of war and avoid what? What were they doing with these people they captured? Shooting them. They were lining them up and shooting them. So one advantage he thought of declaring independence would be these captured patriots that they've been shooting on sight for treason as rebels now would have to be treated as prisoners of war. That was a benefit. Now, would that hit the purse strings of someone that knew somebody that had been executed or was a prisoner of war that was going to be executed? Certainly it would. Another advantage he stated, which makes sense, pretty common sense, is if they declare their independence, how about the property of all Americans that remained loyal to the king that lived in the colonies? What would that property happen to that property? They could seize it. So once they declare independence as a unit, anyone that was a loyalist, you could take their property because they were staying loyal to the king and not bearing their independence against Great Britain. That was what his second thought process was. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Have you seen the movie The Patriot? What did they do to the guy's farm? What did they do to Mel Gibson's farm? Who's seen The Patriot?
I haven't.
Remember,
for a long time.
but he was not for war at first, and they considered him a loyalist. The British came, and other colonists were upset at him. They ended up taking his farm. Watch it. Okay? All right, and the third one we've already talked about. He stated out in his pamphlet from a common sense perspective that we'll have a better chance of winning foreign aid from France, Spain, and the Netherlands because they certainly would favor a war that would weaken Great Britain because they're enemies of Great Britain. So he says, if we declare our independence finally, and we say, hey, we are going to fight for our independence, you've been talking to Spain and France and the Netherlands, but they're probably a little apprehensive to help us unless we go to war, because if we go to war, that's going to weaken Great Britain, and they're more likely to throw in with us and help us out. Because, I got to tell you something, kids, in the end, at this point in history, do the colonists really believe they can win a war with Great Britain without those people? They do not. They're right that they probably don't think that. So, that is Paine's Common Sense, okay? It's simply a pamphlet that came out in January of 1776. Paine was a former British political writer. He came to America in 1774. He included in his Common Sense pamphlet that I offered nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. He pointed out, as Count Verzane had in 1767, that the United States was a different, or the American colonies, excuse me, was a different nation with interests of its own, and he thought it was "'tis time to part." And he gives 3 practical advantages. Okay? Captured patriots could demand to be treated as prisoners of war and avoid being shot as rebels. The patriot governments could seize property of all Americans who remain loyal to Great Britain, and the patriots would have a better chance of winning foreign aid from France and Spain because a war would weaken Great Britain. So what we'll talk about on Monday is the actual beginning and ending of the formal Declaration of Independence. It didn't just get signed and we moved on. There had to be a resolution in the Second Continental Congress that promoted it. It had to be written. It had to be accepted. It had to be, final draft, the whole 9 yards. And so there's a story behind the Declaration of Independence that you may not know that we will talk about. Then the last thing we will end up with, kiddos, will be reactions to the independence, and then that assignment that you have, that I handed out at the start of the test material, we'll be working on that as well, and that has to do after we talk about the Declaration of Independence. Okay? So we're making good progress. Tomorrow, you'll be in here for a brief period of time. You don't have to bring your binders. I'm not sure what we'll do.
Oh, it's, the band is coming through after second.
Okay, after second.